So that informs a lot of where we're coming from. Across our jobs, we are mostly covering national stories. And let's get into it, Sequoia and Christina. How does Native education fit into your work?
So I am an education reporter. I cover national K-12 education. So it fits in absolutely, but it's something that I also seek out just because it's an area that I'm very passionate about, and we don't have an Indigenous Affairs beat at NPR, which is a huge oversight and something we're trying to fix. So if you're interested in that, let me know. But I definitely seek out stories about Native education that can have a national angle. But day to day, I'm covering the news in education, which oftentimes is like student loans and affirmative action recently, and the big education stories. Those are my beat, and Native education is something that I've definitely tried to incorporate more into every story that I do, not just specific stories about specific schools.
So I'm definitely more of a generalist, and as a producer, I'm not necessarily always choosing the things that I get to work on or report on, but I have a big interest in education and have worked on A Story, a podcast episode, the first one that I reported with Sequoia, about a school that was opening on the Standing Rock Reservation, and fingers crossed it happens, working on another story that has to do with education and language specifically.
All right, so I think before getting into it, even though a lot of you are familiar with education, we should break down some of the unique ways that Native students interact with the US education system. We've broken it down into some pretty broad categories. There's the legacy of boarding schools, how government funding interacts with Native students differently, reservation and BIE schools, and the general US history curriculum. That's a list, Sequoia, but what are some challenges that you face reporting on some of these relationships?
You know what's funny in you saying that list? I rarely do stories about curriculum. Mm-hmm. I rarely look at US history curriculums, just because they vary by state, and also a lot of them are up for debate right now. Which maybe is a story in and of itself, so thanks for reminding me of that. But in general, there's challenges at every level. I think I'm coming in as a person who very much wants to listen and elevate the voices in whatever community I get the privilege of raising their story to a national audience. But a lot of times, especially when you're talking about the legacy of boarding schools, especially when you're talking about reservation and BIE schools, there's a lot of red tape that goes into it, and I'm still learning to navigate that, but it is definitely a challenge always to work with.
Would you be willing to talk about a time that you've needed to?
Yeah. So I did a story with Allison Herrera, who is the Indigenous Affairs reporter at KOSU. It came out a couple months ago, but we started working on it in September of 2022. So it came out in June of this year. So it was a long process. And essentially what we wanted to do was go inside Riverside Indian School, which is a school in Anadarko, Oklahoma, that is still open, and it has been running continuously. It's one of a handful of boarding schools that has never closed, and that they've never demolished all of the buildings. So there's a lot of memories, there's a lot of trauma in the physical presence of the school. But Allison reports on the entire state of Oklahoma, and she had never been able to get in. She'd never been able to get inside. And so when we connected through an education reporter at her station, I was like, okay, I feel like I can help here, because NPR is a national news organization, and generally federal agencies will just take my emails. Even if they won't answer them, they will answer them well. They'll just be like, okay, we'll try. I will get a response, and I'll normally get a phone number from that response. Then I can just pester them over and over again. So we worked together to try to get access to this school, and it took us genuinely from September 2022 to like January 2023 to get them to okay a visit. And even then, the terms of the visit were, it was a tough negotiation because, oh yeah.
Was the barrier here the school administration or a different level?
I never got to talk to the school administration. I think that was the problem, is it's a BIE school. And so the BIE is super protective, as I completely understand, of these students. It's also a residential school, so the students live there. So if you do get access, you get access to a lot more of students' lives than you would in like a normal K-12 public school. So we were very, very cognizant of that, but we also knew that we were like two Indigenous journalists trying to tell the truth about what's happening at this school. And so it definitely got frustrating, but you just have to remove your ego from it, call them 1,000,000 times, and then call them 1,000,001 times, and then get everything in writing. And still there will be challenges, but we eventually got the visit, and there were more hurdles, but we can
We're going to talk
talk
more
about that later.
We're going to talk more about the body of that story, but more about the process. What agencies tend to knot you up the most? Are you allowed to call them out by name, you think?
I mean, I think I've already said BIE like 15 times, so that's so great. No one email them. But I've worked with them the most, and I really don't fault them at all. It's protocol. It's the federal government. It's supposed to be purposely very slow, and it drives me crazy. I'm sure it drives some of you that cover these issues crazy. But I also think there's like understaffing, and there's just there's nerves that come from a really good place where they want to protect these stories. And to me, as a journalist who's trained to be like, what are you hiding? I'm like, why? Why won't you let me see this school? Why won't you let me talk to students? And I think that happens with a lot of federal agencies. Like when I'm talking to federal student aid, they are also KG. But just in this case, it was the BIE almost acted as the school district. And so I've never had that experience, like with a school district trying to connect with, I live in LA, so like LAUSD would never put me through those hurdles. So it's just a different thing.
Are there any other groups in covering education generally that like put up that kind of institutional hurdle other than the Bureau?
Not that I've experienced. I mean, I think if you have experience covering education at any level, school districts, some are really wonderful to work with and some are tough to work with. But I think that it's a unique challenge in covering. It is just a handful of schools, so I don't want to like hammer home this point too much, but with Riverside, it was tough.
Yeah. And Christina, we're going to talk more about the bulk of this other story later, but you've done reporting with a school that was kind of not through a lot of formal government channels. How did you navigate that reporting process and that relationship? And do you want to explain in more detail than I just did?
Yeah, so I was really interested. This was like after like summer of 2020, after George Floyd, and I had been really interested in like all of this energy happens. There's a movement, people come together, they do something, and then what happens? Like change is enacted or not enacted. And so the other sort of movement that I could think of that to me felt like that had that same sort of energy was the No DAPL movement. And so I was really interested in like what happened afterwards. Like obviously this is like people's lives. The pipeline was built, but like that doesn't mean that the people who were against that are happy about it. So I was really interested in that as like a broader theme. And as I was doing some research, saw that there was a school that popped up on the camp, and maybe saying popped up is not totally fair because a lot of work went into that. There were parents who were also educators, Native parents who were also educators, who created this school so that they could stay and like participate in this movement, and they wouldn't have to worry about their kids, the government basically saying that like they're not in school, they wouldn't have to go back. So they set up a system, and they set up an education. They set up a whole school on the movement camp, and that was really fascinating. And then when I was looking into it, I saw that they had a Facebook page, and they were, 5 years later, building an actual structure and creating a school on Standing Rock. And so I was really interested in looking at like how they went about doing that and how they sort of like kept that energy going. And knowing that I'm not Native myself, and also that I hadn't done very much education reporting, Sequoia was in Chicago one weekend when I was there, and she came over to my brother's place, and I was like, hey, I'm really interested in this, and you have the education knowledge, you're also Native, and I don't feel like if we have someone who is Native, I should be the one telling the story by myself. Would you want to work on this with me? And so we got approval to work on it, and then, kind of went off from there. I messaged the Facebook page and was like, hey, I'm interested. I work for Code Switch. I would love to hear about what it is that you're doing and where you're at. And we had an initial phone call, and then a bunch more conversations, brought Sequoia in. Sam, who is not here right now, was a fellow for Code Switch. He was a reporting fellow at the time. And so I was also like, I feel like, again, if we have another Native person on the team, like, he should be here, and it's an opportunity for him to also learn how to do audio production and field recording. I feel like there were a lot more opportunities, before the pandemic, to go out and do a tape sync. For us with audio, like, yes, you can record over Zoom, yes, you can do a phone call, but the quality is so much better when you get to go in person. And as I'm sure you all know as reporters, it's really important. Like, there's just so much more information when you get to go in person. So we ended up going as a team of 3 to South Dakota and doing this story.
We went to North Dakota. We had to
You're right,
stay
yes.
in North Dakota, and then we drove down to Standing Rock every day.
Yeah, and it was this sort of funny thing when we got there, and Camila was like, okay, we're gonna meet you outside of this college, Sitting Bull College, and then we'll drive you to the location. And we're like, okay, we have no idea where this is, but she was like, you need 4-wheel drive. And this is the structure that they were constructing. So over the time that we were there, that didn't exist at first, and then actually that one did. They were building a second structure.
How about we just dive more into this story right now? I'd love to play you a few excerpts from this reporting. This first one is the very beginning of this final 30-minute podcast episode. It's going to be 3 minutes long, and if I see people's attention start to wane, we might end it early. But hopefully it's good,
Today, a story about a school and how some other schools failed some students over and over again.
I used to have this history class, and one of the vocab words was reservations. And a bunch of these kids just didn't know what it was, or the definition of a reservation. And it's just I've lived on a reservation most of my life.
That's Precious Traversy. She's 17 years old. Her brother Matthew White Mountain is 16.
When I went to school, 4 out of 7 of my classes were substitutes, which I didn't learn or do any work because I couldn't, because they were substitutes, which weren't really teaching.
And their sister, Alana LeBeau, is 17 too.
I was bullied for how dark I was, and I was never called Native American. They thought I was black or Mexican, and they would make so many racist jokes about it.
Matthew loves skateboarding. Alana loves reading. And Precious, she loves hanging out with her family. They're the kind of siblings who are also best friends, laughing and joking the whole time we talk to them. We met them at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, just outside of the biggest town, which is actually a pretty small town of 569 people, according to the 2020 census. It's called McLaughlin.
It was a Thursday afternoon, and they left school to come talk to us. We sat on the dirt floor of a domed structure facing each other. The air smelled like cedar from all the fresh wood around us, and you could see bright blue sky through an opening in the roof.
Outside, the wind was kicking up dirt and dust everywhere. But inside, it was warm and peaceful.
The serenity of the space didn't quite match the stories we heard from the kids about all the schools they'd been to in communities around South Dakota, on and off the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River reservations.
A lot of Dupree kids, they really think because they live on the res that they have a right to make fun of Native Americans and stuff. So like recently they made a video of them dancing outside a gas station, like just making fun of us.
Down in Eagle Butte, everyone's like, they're in that mind frame of like they're just stuck there, and there's no good on the outside world or on the reservation just because how they've been treated in their life and what they've seen.
During ball, a lot of Native Americans struggled to play it in Dupree because they were being harassed by white people and white parents because they were better than their white kids. A Native American can't be better than a white kid, or else they just get sat on bench.
Both of these schools are on the reservation. Dupree High School has an enrollment of about 100 students. Around 87% of those are Native, and 10% are white.
So being at a majority Native school didn't make that much of a difference.
Yeah, they were getting bullied on the reservation and off, too.
But maybe worse than that is the indifference these kids said they experienced from the adults around them. Alana remembers one teacher.
And like she handed us these big old Lakota books, and she was like, pick 10 words and write the definition out and then just leave it on my desk. So we did all that, and then she just like, she looked at it and she counted like how many papers were there, and she just like threw them away. Like didn't bother to look at the words we wrote. She just counted to make sure we did it.
Going back more than 100 years, education for Native kids has been like this. Which brings us to this question.
If you've tried many, many schools and they all suck, where do you go?
I know it's always awkward to listen to a podcast excerpt. Thank you.
That was long, guys. I'm sorry. It never gets easier to listen to your own voice.
Nope.
But so you've already kind of set up how you got into the story. That's just the intro talking about the landscape of schools in South Dakota, but then you focus on the Mini-Wachoni school. Do you want to talk more about what you learned about how that school was being set up?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I actually listened to this a few weeks ago, but I've already forgotten how the intro goes. And as I was listening to it, I feel like thinking about the different structures that we're talking about. So there wasn't necessarily a BIE school, so we didn't have to deal with that. But we did have to go in and discuss and look at the makeup of the schools that these kids had gone to. They were dropping all of these names and understanding that information. We were fact-checking a lot of that stuff as well. And then we're talking about a school structure that is coming up that's completely outside of that system. So it was learning, for me at least, about both of these things, right? There's the public schools and what they have and how they work and the makeup of the teachers and the students. And then there's also this thing that they're creating, which functions more on a credit system. And the parents that were creating this were Native parents who are also teachers who were making a language immersion school. And they had a language immersion nest that already existed out of Sitting Bull College. So they had seen a model that worked for pre-K and kindergarten students, but they really wanted to create something that would work, all the way up through graduation. And as you hear these kids saying, they maybe had access, they were on the reservation, they had access to their culture through their parents, and they were learning Lakota in school, but they weren't necessarily being taught in a way that was respectful or valued the things that they were trying to learn and really valued themselves. So one of the big lessons for me, and was really great working with Sequoia, who's always working with kids as an education reporter, was the importance of hearing their voices and the stories that they were sharing with us. So they took the day off from school that day and were sitting with us for 3 hours or something, just telling us all about their experiences. And it was everything from how much they love going to sweat and how much they love their siblings to being really vulnerable and honest about some of the things that they had experienced in classes, which I think really helped understand why this was so important. This is just one aspect, right, of why this is so important for kids to feel valued and understood in the place that they're learning, so that they can sort of reach the goals that it is they're trying to figure out. And then as we go in deeper into the story, we obviously also talk to the parents who are creating this, but who are they making this for, and why is that important? I think was a really I don't know, big lesson for me. Like, I think I probably would have gotten there anyway, but it was like with Sequoia doing this all the time, whereas like in my work, I'm mostly talking to adults who are, you know, quote unquote experts or have written books or have lived experiences in other ways, but there was so much value from talking to the kids. And I'm sure a lot of U.S. education reporters already know that, but it was just like a really, really good reminder about the importance of having all of these different perspectives, from like a kid who's really young to elders who stopped by as this construction was happening and were telling us about their own experiences and why this was valuable to them.
I think it's really important to acknowledge, I guess I didn't work on this, but you know, as national level reporters, you are coming into a community that's not your own and bringing the story out pretty widely. How did you all think about that, especially with this community?
This is like one of the most important parts of my job to me, is to establish the relationship early and maintain that relationship far after the story comes out. I think that we have an immense privilege of having a large audience at our organization, and I can only be responsible for the things that I am putting out, I think, and I'm going to take the most care possible and continue those relationships as long as possible, even though I don't think we have any ideas of going back to Minnewachuny. Maybe we will, but we have like maintained contact with them, and they just graduated their first class, and it was such a like happy and wonderful event. And I think about the kids all the time, like Precious especially. I think that you have to go in as a human and go in knowing that this community is letting you in, and that is the biggest privilege you can ever receive from people. And in terms of this story, the women that we met specifically were just so generous with their time and with their energy, because I'm always very cognizant of the fact that when I'm asking questions about their own education history, and especially when you're chatting with elders and you don't know how they were brought up, it really is important to know that you're asking them to expend a lot of emotional energy. And so I try to be very, very careful in the way that I ask things, and also the amount of questions. As a radio reporter, it's like kind of a cliche, but a thing that we do all the time, to ask the same question over and over again to get the right way of wording, because sometimes you'll ask someone, how's your day to day? And they'll kind of pause and they'll say something, and then you'll be like, but how did you feel today? Like, what did you do? And then they already know now the content of it, so they'll say it a little bit better the second time. With questions like this, when you're asking, why do you not like going to school? To these kids, it was very important to not hammer these kids with questions, and the adults as well, because I think that knowing the amount of energy that it's taking them to like dig that up and then say it to you, a stranger, is very difficult. And I always try to just tips on an actual like literal level is get on their level, like sit on the ground with them. Make sure that if you're tall, I'm quite tall. I'm generally taller than my sources. It doesn't bother me with adults, but with kids, I always try to make sure we're sitting down so that I'm not like a scary person to them. But I honestly forgot the question.
Well, we were talking about coming in as a national reporter.
Yes. Yeah, just be a human.
You covered a lot.
Yeah.
I would also add, I think one of the things that's really awesome about radio that I'm not sure how much happens when you're writing as a reporter on your own, and I know that this also happens with our reporters, but in this situation, we had a team of 3 people who were going, and there were a lot of moments of being able to talk about how it was that we felt and what it was that we were picking up from those things. And I think having those conversations, when we went to the build site every day, we had to drive like an hour and a half, 2 hours. I can't remember now. It was a long time, 2 hours. And we ended up spending a lot of that time talking about like what we had just heard and what we had just experienced and how it made us feel. And it was really interesting hearing each other's experiences in school and like with our own bullying and things like that, that I think helped us then, the next time we were approaching the same people or different people, to ask those questions with a lot of empathy and sort of keep building. And then in our writing too, I think allowed us to get to that place. Yeah.
And also just as a caveat, something that I had to do as like a Native person entering this situation, hearing all of their horrible tales of bullying and things like that. And I grew up, my sister and I were the only Native kids in any school we ever went to. We grew up outside DC with an NFL team that has now changed their name, but while I was growing up, they had not changed their name. It was a big part of growing up was like dealing with that, especially with younger children. When I was also a younger child, it was quite bad, and I just always assumed that was because I was in isolation in many ways. Like my dad had moved to an area where there were just not people that looked like us. But hearing from these kids, hearing that, I called my dad crying like every day that we were there, because it's also important to know that you as the reporter are allowed to be feeling things and should be processing those things, and that will make you a much more open and warm presence, like when you come back, when you've processed those with your family, with your friends, with whoever. It's important to like keep an eye on yourself.
Just one more thing off of that. I think like what you brought up is like we're all going to come in with assumptions, even if it is close to our lived experience or something we think. And so paying a lot of attention to those assumptions and what it is that's actually happening, and then digging into the why. So after hearing these kids say that stuff and looking at the numbers, it was like, that was also shocking to be like, well, the school that they're talking about being bullied in is 80% Native. Like, I don't know, I'm Colombian, and I was also like the only like Latina in my school, and a lot of people grew up calling me Cocaine Cala. And like my dad, it was really funny. I remember telling this story, and he was like, they're still doing that? They haven't come up with something better? So yeah, I think that assumption also like ended up, at least for me, like making the case for the school even stronger, understanding it.
I think I want to caveat a little bit that obviously we're talking about this story that got to be kind of a long feature, more documentary-like thing that the team got to spend a lot more time on than the usual news hit. So I guess, Sequoia, since you're usually doing news hits, how is that different than your other reporting processes?
For sure. I think when I look back at the stories that I've been able to cover in Indian country on the education beat, they generally are longer term things, just because I like to take a lot of care with my sources. Like Riverside took almost a year. When I'm doing like quick turn stuff, it's normally about news, so I'm looking at my notes because I forget the date, but yeah, in like November of last year, there was like this survey that came out in November of last year about how increased COVID money had really impacted tribal colleges, and had not only impacted the students at those colleges, but also the communities, just because in talking to many tribal college presidents, they really see their schools as just like hubs for the community. So a lot of money was pumped in with like ESSER funding and such due to COVID, and that was used a lot of the time on broadband and getting broadband to the whole community, which is wonderful and cool. So when I'm doing stories like that, I'm normally talking to like public officials, like a school president, or like someone who did the survey, and I did do, well, actually the story that I did off of the Gila River community, that was a quick turn that did involve talking to sources. It was a lot. I went for the Road to Healing event that the Department of Interior put on, and it was a quick turn. I went to the Gila River event, and then also the one on the Navajo Nation near Window Rock the next day, maybe 2 days later. And in both of those, if any of you have been to Road to Healing events, they are very tough events to cover as a reporter, because it's open to the public, it's a public forum. Secretary Holland sits at the front along with Undersecretary Newland, and they just listen to boarding school survivors and community members who have experience, whether themselves or with their family, with the boarding school system. And that was a quick turn that I had to do. It was a little bit different because I was only interviewing the people who had decided to stand up and share their story. So it was a public forum. They knew that there was press there. We were very clearly marked like press table. And then when you walked up after, everyone had a badge. So it's a little bit different. I think I try to work, especially when there's kids involved, I try to do a longer runway on a piece.
Yeah. I'm personally of the belief that a lot of the value Sequoia's reporting adds to NPR is the time and consideration she takes. But obviously this is a large, mostly white, definitely mostly non-native institution. And so most of your collaborators, your editors, your producers, your reporters are non-native. I think those were two different questions that came out at the same time, but you know, whatever. How do you think through that? And I guess to make it a more optimistic and specific question, how have you been supported?
Yeah, I have pretty good editors, I think. I'm lucky in that way. They generally kind of defer to me as the person who has been read in and has experienced the story firsthand. That being said, I wish I had editors that were read in. And Sam and I both do this at NPR. We always have like an outside reader for something that's very long, like Standing Rock. For Riverside we didn't, but I mean, Allison is like such an expert in and of herself that we didn't feel like we needed one. I'm working on 2 episodes right now that we're also gonna have readers for, where we just get someone who is very much steeped in the community, who like lives on a reservation, has grown up on a reservation, has covered as a journalist a reservation. As normally we try to get someone from the community that we're reporting on to read it at the end once we've like gone through the whole editorial process, just because I think at a majority white organization like NPR, I personally want that backing. Like I would like to, in my ideal world, I would have other staffers in the newsroom that I could bounce ideas off of, but it doesn't really work like that right now. So that's kind of how we try to balance that. I have felt supported in most things. I think it's a lot of emotional labor to convince people sometimes that a story is worth doing. Like right now, I had like a little bit of trouble with my editor to convince him about a story about Native joy. I just really wanted to focus on bringing like a little bit of joy. And he was like, but what's the angle? Like, why? And I was like, but what if what's crazy is that it's just joyful? I would love to just report one of these stories and not cry at the end of every day. I would love to feel, because there's so much joy happening in these communities. And so that was a little bit of pushback, but like, I mean, he's letting me do it, so, so it's okay overall, but definitely it's a process.
I've been jumping around a bit, but I need to indulge something I want to talk about, which is going into a school community with a bunch of microphones, especially with like younger kids. And I guess I want to bring this up by playing this excerpt, which I swear is shorter than the other one.
And as we're admiring the construction and talking about all of it with Kimamila, these little kids show up with their teacher. One of them is playing a recorder, another one is playing Uno.
It was so cute. There was this little line of them walking into the Earth Lodge, and then they spread out all over and just started playing music and just like playing in the dirt in general.
And everything they were saying was in Lakota. And Kimamila just lit up watching them.
IJA, that's our word for children. And it means sacred beings. So these are the sacred ones. So how do you treat the sacred ones? What do you do for the sacred people or the sacred beings?
Yeah. Definitely makes you look at them a little differently, even as they're being silly and playing.
I used to struggle with classroom discipline, like a lot. And then when I switched from calling students to Troja, na Troshka, na Michincha, my child, my niece, my nephew, it all shifted in the classroom too. I'm their auntie. You don't talk that way to your auntie.
So, the main reason I wanted to play that clip is because those kids seemed so hype on those recorders. Was that planned? Did they just come in like that?
I don't remember. Do you remember?
They just showed up. We had talked to Kimila about recording, and everyone that showed up, because there was a lot of people showing up throughout the day. When they showed up, we would, say we're recording, we're doing a story, this is where we're from, answer any questions that they had. And often, with audio at least, like someone's just kind of standing around using like a tool, and then you're like, hi, can I come get in your face? And I know I'm recording everything that you're saying for an hour, but let me tell you how I'm going to use it. It's going to be like 5 seconds, and it's texture. Like, no one's going to come back and be like, he was saying this to this person and blah, blah. And so, yeah, we were just standing in there. It was like a very windy day, and that was like the only place you could kind of be shielded from it. And then, yeah, this little line of kids comes in with their teacher. And even that, she was like, we don't have permission to like record the teaching or the parents. But as I was talking to her, that was what was happening in the background. And then when we got towards the end of the story, when we were working on it, just also explaining to her, like, we have this sound, you can't identify who these people are. It's really as background noise, and maybe you'll hear a little voice, but we're not using it in that way. So also making sure that that was run by her in the moment that it was happening, and explaining why it was that we were recording, and then also afterwards, because again, that is trust and that is respect. So like making sure that people understand our process as well.
How did you navigate like formal, informal consent? Were there any like?
Well, the good thing is I was trained, and I think Christina was also trained in this way, to leave the car with the microphone running and with the red recording thing just like on, and come up and be like, I'm recording, and just don't turn it off the whole time. That way you can ask on record and say, is it okay that we're recording this? And they'll say exactly what they want to say, and then from that you'll have an exact record of like that exchange. I think it's always helpful, even if you did that, to then go back, as we did, and we were like, the sound of kids, when you're working with kids, just be like 50 times more careful. It's so worth it in the end. You never want to mess up with kids. And also, just from a legal perspective, I end up working with our lawyers a lot at NPR on various stories, because each state has very different protections for minors, and what you can use and what you can't use, and what you need explicit permission of. And we didn't run into issues there, but we really just wanted to make sure that no one in the community that had welcomed us so wonderfully was surprised or upset by sounds that we were putting on the radio to millions of people.
Yeah. And before we even got there too, like, I don't know, I just feel like you're not really like getting recorded all the time by people. Like, nobody is, right? Unless maybe you're a politician. And even that, like, you're getting recorded in a way that you are in control of, right? You say, press can be here, press can't be here, you can record my comments, and that's it. But being recorded in this way, where it's like the way you're living your daily life, is not normal. It's super weird. So we had a lot of calls before we came, where I was like, okay, so this is what I'm interested in. Like, we're trying to get a sense of like daily life. How does this work? I'll probably want to grab sound of this. I'll probably want to grab sound of this. And really just like walking people through what it is that they're like, why it is that we're gathering the thing, how it is that the process is going to work, and like what we're sort of going to be in partnership creating a little bit, because they're, someone's living their life and you're there just recording. And Sequoia and I were talking about this yesterday too, about like along those lines, like the fact that in a lot of these situations, this isn't someone who is media trained, who's talking to journalists all the time, who knows what it means necessarily to have their story shared. And so it is also about having those conversations of saying like, okay, this is going to be on the radio. It is going to be broadcast in all of these states. It is going to be online. It is going to be something you can find on your phone. When your name is Googled, like, it'll be tied to you. It's there in perpetuity. Like, things don't disappear on the internet. So also just
we'll run it again.
And we'll run it again, yeah. So then people are probably going to look this up again. So just like being really honest and upfront about what it is that someone is signing up to do. In this case, like, this is a school, they're really, I think she was really excited to have us there and like invested in the project. But, people might also be sharing things that are traumatic, and like they might be interested in having that story out, but the real ramifications of that might not be as considered. So I think there was also quite a bit of that, and thinking about that as we were going through it. And even with the kids, like their parents were there. They're also in charge of putting the school together. Memory is their mom, and I'm forgetting.
Hope Sheila.
Sheila, yes, thank you. So, they were there and they gave us consent, and we kind of explained some of those things to the kids too. But in the editing process too, I think that we were thinking about like some of those things, like what would, they feel comfortable maybe having out there, or we feel comfortable having out there. And I've definitely had that experience on stories not about education too, right? Like someone might sign off on something and you want to be respectful of that, but you also want to think about like, well, what are the actual ramifications? Do we need to make sure, did we do a good enough job making sure that they understand that? And again, in education stories, that might not always be the case, but like it's also worth keeping that in mind, yeah.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on time, and I would love to leave time for audience questions, but I would love to do some real quickies. The first is, a reason I wanted to include that clip is because it sort of introduces a little bit more about how that project is decolonizing education. But I feel like there's so many of those stories that are very individual out there, so we're gonna flip it back to the super standardized colonized education. And this is not a good transition, I'm sorry. Let's go back to—
Okay, Jess.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was gonna put it in higher education, but we're gonna skip
That's okay,
that.
yeah.
You've already talked about your reporting about the road
Yeah.
to healing a little bit, but I think it would be good to hear a little bit more quickly about the Riverside School
Yeah.
and how talking about boarding schools fits into your reporting on like the kind of active living education system.
For sure. Riverside, by the time they let us go visit, which was, again, a very long process to get there, I was so convinced that they were hiding stuff. I was just like going in being like, it wouldn't take you 4 months to let me come visit unless you were like scrubbing every single thing off of every single surface. But when we got there, it was, we definitely, Allison and I went in ready to like hard-hitting expose of this school because we just had such a tough experience up until then. And when we got there, the administration, which was, again, the first time we were able to speak to anyone who worked at the school, was honestly like very lovely. And they were protective, but they were protective in a way that I understand and respect 100%. And we really had to check ourselves like right when we got there. And
was the assumption that they were hiding like old school boarding
no,
school
we
crap?
we just didn't know
Okay.
what was up. And Allison had worked in Oklahoma for so long covering Indigenous affairs, and she'd tried many, many times to get in this school, and they had never let her go. And so that was where I came in and like was able to lend a little bit of my privilege as like being from the larger branch of her same organization, but people look at NPR like a little bit differently when you're dealing with the federal government, I think. And so we tried to just like amplify those requests she'd had over years and years. So by the time we got there, we were like, okay, why wouldn't you let her in anytime? Because it was a lovely school. There are problems in every school. And there were problems even after the visit that we had to deal with. But we ultimately saw a school that the kids are happy and clothed and living in like beautiful dorms with lots of decorations and teachers who are like far and wide majority Native, who really care about turning this place into a place that celebrates Native culture, who had, a lot of the teachers had parents and grandparents who had gone to Riverside. They themselves had gone to Riverside. This was very much a community school that the community had decided to like reinvigorate and turn into something that they could be proud of. And that was what we saw. We saw we talked to students, which ended up being a problem. They really didn't want us to talk to any students. And as we've now talked a lot about, when I'm reporting on a school, I will never put it on the radio unless I have a student in the piece, because why would I talk about a specific school and only talk to the principal? That doesn't make any sense. I want to hear from a student. And Riverside would not let us do that. And that was why we visited in February. It didn't come out until June, because we were just trying to get them to let us put one student's voice in this piece. Because that's really important to me, and it's a standard that I have with all of my stories, and I don't think, and I'm still upset that we had to compromise on this one, but it forced us to make the piece more multi-generational. It forced us to talk to recent alumni, students who had graduated like the year prior, students who still had siblings at the school, ex-students who are now parent age, who are about to send their students to that school. So we got to fill out the story in other ways, but it ultimately turned into a different story than we thought it was going to be at the beginning. And it's one I'm still very proud of, and that I know everyone in the piece is very happy about, which is generally like a nice thing as a reporter. If you don't get any angry emails, it's like, okay, whew.
Yes, so I would love to open it up for questions if anyone has anything. Yeah, let me.
I love education. It's my beat in general, and I think that so many of the world's problems right now can be fixed by good and thorough education. And I try to cover every aspect of education, and I think that a part of it that is often not covered is Native education and education in Native communities. So I try to seek out those stories to elevate them, just because I think it's important, and I think that our audience should know more about it. And I think there's also a lot of very exciting, cool innovation happening in Native education. I'm working on a story that's not about education right now for a history podcast. And when we got there and we're visiting, it was on Red Lake Nation in near the border of Canada. And it's a very, very cool area. And when we got there, they were like, let me show you our school. And I was like, no way. Their school, guys, had 84 students. It opened in September. I was like, that's insane. 84 students between grades 4 and 7. That's a lot of students for a new school. I was overwhelmed. It was amazing. So I think that even when you're just reporting in Indian country, sometimes the education stories will find you. Like it'll just seep through, because it's something that there has been investment in recently, in the past 2 decades or so, by tribes, and I think that it's an exciting time to report on it. So I try to just bring it in.
I think like being on the race and identity beat, I'm really fascinated by language, and also by like, I'm trying to think of the words for this, but it's almost like when you're learning history, when you're in English class, all of those things, it's identity building and it's myth building, and it is like outside of you, but it's also so personal, and it can inform so much of the way that you move in the world. And so I think that's where my fascination with education comes. It's not something I do all the time, but I think a lot about like the things that I've learned and how that has affected ways. And I think that I think so much about like there are so many Americans who like still are like, where are the Native people? They don't exist anymore. And I'm like, no, they absolutely do, and they're here. And so I think there's also like the visibility aspect of that, which I'm really fascinated by, and how through our education system, that invisibility is being created, right? Like there is a systemic thing that is happening that is then creating this like national idea or identity. And so like, how do you break down that system, or how do you sort of poke at it and start to learn about it? And I just came from visiting Columbia, where like similarly I was at one of the like big museums there. There's a gold museum, and it's all gold that's pre-Columbian, so all of the like native peoples to Columbia. And it was so interesting because I was standing there and we had just spent like hours looking at all of these artifacts, and understanding all of these cultural and religious traditions that are still very much alive in a lot of places in Columbia, even though same thing there. People don't necessarily know. And there were people that were standing in front of this thing, and they're like, wow, there are 85 tribes in Colombia, and they like exist, and there are 36 languages. I'm like, what? I had no idea. And I'm like, it's kind of in so many different places too. Like even today I was asking Jess, like, what is the like Native situation in Taiwan? Like that, it exists everywhere, right? But there's like this erasure. So I think for me, education is a place where I see that erasure happens. And also, you know, in the story that we've reported and some of the stuff that Sequoia is reporting, and I'm sure a lot of the stuff that you're reporting, it's like, we're here, it exists. Like, and actually, yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening, and there's like, you know, a lot of really amazing stuff to really fight against that and honor and uplift. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I would like to add a little bit as like a almost unrelated person, but this is my first time in Canada, and I feel like even over the last like 2 days here, the line between the boarding school era and the current state of Native education is like very, very clear to me how like those things need to be understood in relation to each other. And I think that's fascinating, and that it's bad that I had not considered that until sort of being in a space like how Canada just engages with Native issues differently than the US. Any other questions?
I don't need a mic.
Okay. I'll give up on this.
So I live in a community with several schools, public schools, BIE schools, Catholic schools, like almost like a charter school type situation. And in Indian country, federal government entities, we all know, are super secretive. They don't have to talk to anybody if they don't want to talk to anybody. So what's like your best practices for that, navigating that within the federal system, but also the tribal system, because tribal governments mimic the federal government in several ways, including their desire to stay quiet.
For sure. I think you're not going to love the answer, but in both cases, my advice is just get in their face. If you can physically be there, do it. The story that I reported on the Road to Healing at the Gila River community and also on the Navajo Nation, that was because the BIE stopped responding to me. They just would not get back to me, and it had been like over a month, and we'd done the proper amount of communication. I had tried, Allison had tried, and I live in LA. I could get there pretty fast. I was like, I'm just gonna go and talk to them. Like, if they see me, they'll remember that they haven't answered my emails for a month, right? And it worked, it did work. I think that obviously that's not always something that you can do with the federal government if they're not coming to your community, but with the tribal government, I've also had trouble on the story that I'm working on about tribal land ownership right now in Red Lake and Leech Lake, the neighboring reservation to the south. We had a really hard time getting the Leech Lake government to speak to us because, again, they don't want to say that, like, even if it wasn't them, if their government messed up at some point, they don't want to talk about it, which I understand. I wouldn't respond to that email if I didn't have to, but we just made the leap and we said, okay, we're just going to show up. We'll just go talk to them. I wonder if anyone's there. And of course you show up and people are much nicer in person. People are always nicer. They didn't give us much, but we just needed comment. We just needed to talk to them. It's so impossible. And if it's ever the federal government and you need like someone to amplify it from a national organization, I'm so happy to do that. I like just, my email is on our last screen, I think, but I see my place at NPR as like a place of immense privilege just in that sense of just like getting in the door. And so if I can ever help you with an introduction or anything in that way, hit me up, 100%.
I think we're willing to stick around if anyone wants to come up and ask questions, but I'd like to do a little bit of wrap-up house cleaning at the end of this presentation. One, our dear colleague Sam Yellowhorse Kesler, who is so sick on the 15th floor of that hotel over there, he was kind enough to just sort of run through a bunch of his work for NPR highlighting Native issues, so we're just gonna show off some of his bylines for him. He helped curate some tiny desks. playlist.
He's kind of a pop culture guy.
Yeah. And Sam and Sequoia lead the Natives at NPR ERG, which I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about.
I mean, it's an internal I don't know. It's
Yeah,
just like
it's
it's a small organization. If you ever want to work for NPR, send me an email, please. And
the important thing is that as part of this ERG, which is an internal thing, they are organizing an external fly-in for member station, Native member station reporters.
yeah, any audio journalists. So if you work in audio at all, please let me know. And
Oh, not just member station, just
Not
any
just member.
audio reporter.
Yes, we're
okay.
trying to include it to any audio journalists. So if you work in broadcast and audio specifically, come up to me, email me.
I don't think your email is actually here, but hit
I'm
her
going to
up.
give you all my email. It's S and then Carrillo, CARRILLO at npr.org. Or you can Google Sequoia NPR. I'm the only one. And it's on there.
All right, that's our time again. Feel free to come up for any more questions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.